Ministers in Ontario, Canada debated a 57-page climate change plan last week that is meant to give $7 billion over the course of 4 years to substantially cut down on emissions and to begin to phase out the use of natural gas and other fossil fuels. While of course skeptics warned that the legislation goes too far, proponents say the goals in the plan are not only achievable, but would be affordable to your average household. So this is something called Cabinet Confidential. It was 80 different policies that were grouped into 32 different actions, and this particular legislation focuses on the years 2017 through 2021 and kind of attaches the price tags associated with some of these actions. So last Wednesday it was debated by Premier Kathleen Wynne's cabinet, and as I said, it's supposed to allot $7 billion over the course of 4 years for different measures to cut down on climate change. So a few of those highlights include, for example, $3.8 billion given in grants and rebates to start phasing out natural gas. They want to provide incentives to retrofit buildings, to give rebates to drivers who purchase electric vehicles, etc. And basically to eventually start to require gas companies to produce gas that has less carbon in it by 5% by 2020. They want to expand the rail network and cycling infrastructure. And they also actually want to give at least $1.2 billion to businesses to help them cut those emissions, to find energy efficient ways. So instead of just being like, you got to do this, they're at least trying to incentivize businesses and then offer them help. So, yeah, I mean, they're basically wanting to get to the point where they want to cut their emissions to 15% below 1990 levels. They want to do that by 2020, then eventually 37% by 2030, and then 80% by 2050. So some people look at this as being pretty ambitious. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, no, for sure, it is ambitious. I think, dare I say it, I think this is going to prove to be one of those kind of test cases. Canada being in that position whereby obviously has got government approval to carry this out, and has got a plan in place and the funds, or they're seeking to earmark those funds and make it available. I'm just, as you're talking, I'm thinking whether that could ever be workable in the United States. Mm-hmm. As things currently stand, with the lobbyists and the interest group and the fossil fuel industry, it seems it's so difficult to ever envisage that. That being said, that's why I say it's a test case. Countries such as Canada will make it, hopefully, if this is successful, will make it untenable for countries like America to continue with their current policy. And the cacophonous sound of pressure, or the cacophony of pressure and sound, or will get to such a point that it will be unworkable, and that just as America eventually, or the United States eventually, got on board with in terms of carbon emissions and seeking to address that, and it's gone a long way from that to go. I feel as though this it will get to that point, but there's certainly not going to be industry leaders for all of those political reasons, but and interests. But it's so I think it's admirable, and it's going to be interesting to see, and hopeful that they will be able to make this a success.
Absolutely. I mean, I think also there's a lot of compromise involved here, because of course there's energy sector leaders that are not particularly happy about this. But then of course the fact that there's at least money being given to the businesses to help them reach these levels. I don't know if something this ambitious right off the bat in America would work, just because of all the lobbying that you're talking about. Everything that we hear about, it's like baby steps, like everything is such a baby step. So this seems really big considering it's over the course of 4 years. But so obviously the big winners here are electric vehicle makers, biofuel producers. There's solar, wind, energy companies. The biggest complaint, of course, is jobs, and worrying about whether or not jobs are going to be lost as a result of making these moves. At the same time, if you invest in these technologies, that's more jobs that are created. So, according to
it requires retraining. I think that's
right.
Part of the problem. It requires retraining, and you're effectively condemning fossil fuel industry to the graveyard, and therefore and you think of it in terms of the workers and the people who've worked there for 20, 30 years, and then seeking to then retrain them. I just want to caution it, as great as this is, I'm not suggesting you are, I don't want to caution us against us being too glib in terms of like, well, it just needs to retrain, and you can just, there'll be more jobs in the renewables.
Sure.
Unfortunately, the grassroots reality of that is just never quite that simple. And I have some sympathy with that, not saying that we shouldn't seek to do this, but there will be real economic, and that's because by understanding that, you understand the resistance.
Right, absolutely, and I most certainly do, but it's like, what's the alternative? We're continuing to see serious effects of climate change that it's like, well, if we're dead, it's not really going to make any difference. You know what I mean? So it's like, I'm more supportive of these kind of ambitious measures. Certainly people in Ontario agree. So for Kathleen Wynne, the Premier Minister, as I was talking about, she said in a preamble that she signed, she said, we are on the cusp of a once-in-a-lifetime transformation. It's a transformation of how we look at our planet and the impact we have on it. It's a transformation that will forever change how we live, work, play, and move. So, I mean, the fact that it's literally changing the kinds of cars that you drive, the kinds of buildings that you live in, the kinds of energy that you use to light and heat your home. Absolutely. And these are things that people
it's a revolution.
Yeah, humans generally are a little bit, they're a little bit scared of change. So it's a revolution of ideas, and I can see why people are having trouble with that, because of course there's tension between the Environment Minister Glenn Murray and other ministers, the Energy Minister, the Economic Development Minister. You know, they have talked about how basically that it's going too far, that the kind of top-down approach is not the way to deal with it, that they should be just adding a carbon tax and kind of going from there. They're not sure, they're skeptical about how they're going to pay for it. Of course, how they're going to pay for it is by using a revenue system based on an upcoming cap and trade system that is expected to pass later on. And that just imposes emission caps on certain industries, and then basically, so they would have to pay more if they surpass those caps, and then of course they can trade with other companies that maybe they're not using as much of their emissions. So that's and those kinds of things have been proposed in the United States as well. So it's not that foreign of a concept. But yeah, I mean, although some people say that putting the carbon tax in place would be more effective than lowering other taxes and then letting the markets just run themselves, as opposed to the government micromanaging, which to me sounds very similar to the kind of arguments we hear in America, where it's just sort of like, let the markets determine how it is. But I do feel like we're at the point with climate change that it takes more than just the markets running themselves, because the markets are not incentivized to establish these new technologies. They're incentivized to keep it the status quo, in my opinion.
For sure.
Am I wrong?
For sure. No, you're absolutely right. And ultimately, ultimately, the change will have to come from the government. It will have to come from international pressure, I would suggest. But it's never going to, if it's left to regulate itself, you're right, there's not going to be significant enough change. It will have to come to a point where it's no longer profitable or sensible. When you're looking at Saudi Arabia is talking about diversification and diversifying away from oil, just because that's the practical realities that they're facing for a whole slew of reasons. Not necessarily they're motivated by climate change, but they recognize that the writing is on the wall. And I would like to assume and hope that the same could be said of the oil companies in this country. Their evidence and their behavior thus far doesn't indicate that they're there, but certainly one assumes that ultimately we will get to a position where there is renewable energy is the primary source of energy in this country. But I think they're going to be kicking and screaming to get us there.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I think your point, saying that this is sort of like a test case, this is a test run, is well taken. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, he's in the process of ratifying the Paris. Look at him, he's such a dreamboat. He's so great, isn't he? He's in the process of ratifying the Paris Accord. Which is an international accord. They're trying to get to keep global temperatures to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So this is kind of in line with he's been very outspoken about climate change and how important it is to keep that under wraps. But and one final point I'll make is the fact that some people say that the cost to the actual taxpayers, the cost to voters is going to be unacceptable. But based on Enviroeconomics, which does advise governments on the effects of economic policy changes, they actually say that the cost per average household is only going to be increased by, it's like $13 a month, which if you compare that to the carbon tax that they would be instating, the carbon tax would add up between a $48 or $107 a month increase. So to me, it's like, if you're talking about money or how it's going to affect taxpayers, that's something to consider. So what do you guys think? Do you think this is super ambitious? Do you think it's something that could ever be done in the United States?